Hey students, this is Dr. Ways and welcome to your lecture on the brain. The brain is divided into two hemispheres, cerebral hemispheres that is, right here, 1 and 2, that's separated from each other by the longitudinal fissure going right down the middle. And then the lobes of the brain follow the same nomenclature that the bones of the skull do. So here you have the frontal lobe, that's right under the frontal bone, parietal lobe under the parietal bone, occipital and temporal lobe. A couple of the separation points to take note. We have right here the lateral sulcus, and that separates the temporal lobe from the frontal and parietal lobes. We've already talked about the longitudinal fissure right here. Here we have the transverse fissure that separates the cerebrum, which is what we've been talking about, from the cerebellum, which means little brain, sitting just inferior and posterior to the cerebrum. And then probably what I consider the most important is the central sulcus right here in the middle. You can see it here on this bottom picture and here on the top picture. And the central sulcus separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobes, and really important because this is going to be your primary motor cortex and this is going to be your primary sensory cortex, and on either side of that are where those centers are. So that in my opinion, that's the most important sulcus to know. Just to remind you that when you look at the brain, it looks wrinkly, and the ridges that are in there, the convolutions here, those are known as gyri, and the little spaces between them, between the folds, are called the sulci, the shallow grooves between the folds. Those are the sulci. So gyri are raised, sulci are indented. All right, and then we separate sulci from fissures because fissures are a lot deeper than sulci are. If you pull the temporal lobe back and look underneath, you'll find a fifth layer, and that is called the insular layer or insula right here. And we'll talk about what all these layers do as we go on, but specifically, this is the only time we're going to mention the insula. The functions of the insula are not fully understood, but it's thought to play a role in homeostasis, emotional regulation, as well as consciousness. So as stated before, here is the central sulcus dividing the primary motor cortex from the primary somatosensory cortex. So if anterior to that line is the primary motor cortex, then that means most of the things that happen in a frontal lobe are motor related. And if they're not motor related, they're involved in things that lead to motor related activities such as concentration, planning, problem solving, and so on. If this part right here is the sensory cortex, then that means everything back here is related to sensory or sensory integration. So that's what happens a lot in the parietal lobe. Occipital lobe is specifically for vision and vision interpretation, and the temporal lobe is primarily involved in hearing, but has some components associated with language as well. So some questions here. How do we test motor cortex? So how do we test various parts of this? Well, we'll get into that in a little more detail in the next slide, but think of motor strength testing, like have somebody AB duck their leg and then AD duck their leg and then do that against resistance, and you're able to test not just how strong the muscles are, but how well the motor area is functioning for voluntary control. How do we test the frontal area? Well, that's when we do our mini mental status exam. Sensory cortex, we can do various sensations in various parts of the body, test the dermatomes, if you will. Remember in an earlier lecture we talked about the sharp end of a stick versus the dull end of the stick, and asking the patient to tell you whether it feels sharp or dull in various areas. And then temporal lobe, of course, hearing. You would test their hearing by any number of means. You'll learn about those in your physical exam lab. And then the occipital lobe, of course, test your vision with the eye chart or various types of eye charts. Two other areas that are going to be important to know are the motor speech area right here. Notice that that is in the frontal lobe, but it borders along the temporal lobe, also known as Broca's area. So when we say motor speech area, that's your ability to actually move the muscles of your mouth and your airway in order to produce speech. I would say it's the motor language area rather than the speech area, because there can be some writing involved as well. Back here, between the parietal and temporal lobes, you have the sensory speech area, or also known as Wernicke's area. And this is involved in the ability to understand spoken word, understand written word, and be able to interpret it. And we know how these work because people who have lesions in those areas tend to have problems. If it's in Wernicke's area, tend to have problems understanding words and understanding language, whereas those in the motor area, they know what they want to say, but the words don't quite come out right. All right, and one more thing to mention about the brain. The left hemisphere is dominant for language-related activities. So it's kind of the noisy, the speech centric lobe, hemisphere, whereas the right hemisphere is not language dominant. So it functions more in the meaning of things, emotions, processing shapes and patterns, attention, meaning of things like that. This is a map of the primary, here we have the motor area on the left and the sensory area on the right. And notice it goes from the middle of the brain down the longitudinal fissure up here and then all the way down the side. And what's mapped there are different areas. So for the motor area, you have your foot and toes in the medial portion, leg up here in the medial to superior portion, then thigh, pelvis. So notice it goes up your body up until you get to the tongue all the way in the lateral portion. And notice that the sensory pretty much follows the same pattern. So what that means is if you had your skull open and your dura mater open and you were poked here in your brain, you would feel it in your hand. Or if they were measuring electrical activity in your brain and had a densely populated EEG machine on your head, and they said, move your right fingers, the fingers on your right hand, and you do, then this area would light up in the left hemisphere of your brain. Remember, left controls right and right controls left. So this map is then called the motor and sensory homunculus. Homunculus means little man because it's a map of a man in your head, or little person rather. If we look at a transverse section of your brain as it's shown down here, you can see, I want to point out a couple things here. One, you notice the gray matter on the outside. That's what we call our cerebral cortex, the gray matter. And then the white matter, remember, is always myelinated axons. So it's myelinated axons that are going from the gray matter to the various parts they need to go, including down to the spinal cord. All right, so that's what you're looking at here. White matter versus gray matter. And specifically what we want to point out in here, within the white matter, you have islands of gray matter, islands of tissue, and those are called the basal nuclei or basal ganglia. And it has several parts. It has the caudate nucleus, the putamen, the globus pallidus, which is this section right here, and that's got two segments, the external and the internal. And you can see the overall structure down here of it looks like this. Almost, to me, it almost reminds me of a coiled up sperm or an embryo. and it is going to be on either side of the thalamus. So note that the thalamus is right here, and these basal nuclei are going to be on either side of the thalamus. And their function of the basal nuclei being secretors of dopamine is to control, regulate motor function. And we know this because we've seen people with Parkinson's disease that have defects in the basal nuclei have those very specific symptoms that indicate that motor control is not being regulated properly. All right, the next structure is the thalamus, and these are the green structures right here. And here would be the putamen and caudate nucleus coming out here, just to give you a frame of reference. So if we do a sagittal section on the brain and cut down the longitudinal fissure and separate it in half, you would get to see the structure of the diencephalon. The first part being the thalamus right here. All right, this section would be the thalamus. Below it would be the hypothalamus, the pineal gland, and the mammillary bodies right here. And as for general functions, the thalamus kind of serves as a relay station for all incoming sensory input and determines where it goes in the cerebral cortex. The hypothalamus is where all of the set points for your major homeostatic regulation mechanisms are housed, so your body temperature, things like that. The pineal gland is responsible for secreting melatonin at night to regulate circadian rhythm sleeping, and the mammillary bodies, which play a role in memories, specifically our ability to recall memories. All right, so another picture of the thalamus. It's kind of cut away here, but it would be this entire section right here. And then just above it, what we would see is a structure called the fornix that goes around. And in the anatomage table, I highly recommend doing a dissection of the brain to find these structures and get a 3D idea of where they are, because the 2D pictures don't do it justice. And surrounding that is going to be the corpus callosum. Now, the corpus callosum is a bridge of axons that go between the cerebral hemispheres, and is responsible for the left cerebral hemisphere being able to communicate with the right cerebral hemisphere and vice versa. All right, so the pituitary gland, which is considered our master gland because of all of the hormones that it secretes and their functions in regulating many other glands within the body, is located, here's your hypothalamus, and to put it in perspective, thalamus, hypothalamus, pituitary gland. So you have this infundibulum, this stalk coming down, and here would be the anterior pituitary gland, and then the posterior pituitary gland sitting behind it. And notice that it is sitting within the hypophyseal fossa of the sella turcica in the bone. All right, so this is its relation, the relation of the gland to that particular structure in the skull. And another frame of reference, the pituitary gland sits below the hypothalamus, but just posterior to the optic chiasma. So if you see the optic chiasma, right behind it should be the pituitary gland. Or if you see the pituitary gland, the little structure right in front of it that looks like an X should be the optic chiasma. And you're not going to see the X from this point of view. You're going to see that from a inferior point of view. So if we have a picture of that later on, we will I'll point it out. All right, just below the thalamus, and obviously connected to it, because if the thalamus is a relay station going to the rest of the cerebral cortex, then the information has to come from somewhere. So it's going to come up the spinal cord through the brainstem. So from inferior to superior, we have the medulla oblongata right here, the pons, and the midbrain right here. Actually, all of this would be considered midbrain. Looking at a posterior view of the midbrain, we have this structure called the corpora quadrigemina, or four twin body. So 1, 2, 3, 4 structures, and if you divide them in half, superior versus inferior, they are known as the superior colliculus. Actually, that's right here, and the inferior colliculus right here. The superior colliculus happens to be involved in visual pathways, and I apologize again, visual, for the typing being off from your PowerPoint. The inferior colliculus then is involved in auditory pathways. All right, and specifically, visual reflexes and auditory reflexes happen within the corpora quadrigemina, visual within the superior colliculus and auditory within the inferior colliculus. All right, the pons from an anterior view is this big structure that's sticking out. It's probably it's the most prominent part of the brainstem that is sticking out. So if you identify the pons, then anything immediately above it would be the midbrain, and anything immediately below it would be the medulla oblongata. And the function of the pons is related to respiratory pathways. In fact, in physiology, I think we talked about, when we talked about regulation of breathing, we had the pontine respiratory group, and that's where that is located, and it connects with the medulla oblongata to right below it to help with respiratory pathways. It's also regulating respiratory pathways, that is. It also is involved in connecting the cerebral hemispheres. I'm sorry, cerebellar hemispheres, because if you look on the other side of it, that has stalks that are going into the cerebellum. The last part is the medulla oblongata, also known as the medulla, and some structures that you see with the medulla are the olives, and the olives are these olive-shaped structures on either side of the medulla, and they're known for being involved in motor coordination. You have the pyramids right here because they're shaped like pyramids. And within the pyramids, notice that you have some decussation going on here. That's where the cortical spinal axons would cross over with each other, remember, from left to right and right to left, so that one side of the body is regulated by the opposite side of the brain. And so a lot of decussation would happen right here in the with the cortical spinal axons within a pyramid. All right, just looking at an inferior view and an anterior view at some of the structures we just talked about. So here's the pons. Here are the mammillary bodies, so you can see the relation of the pons to the mammillary bodies. Here we see the olives of the medulla, the pyramids of the medulla, as well as the pons right here. Another view of the pyramids, and you can see the decussations happening. And then finally over here we see another view, the olive pyramids, and within there that crossing over is going to be occurring. All right, the cerebellum has two hemispheres as well, just like the cerebrum, so we call them cerebellar hemispheres. The cerebellum also has folds, but they are organized a little bit differently than what we saw with the cerebrum. So the raised regions that we see are called folia, and those are what we would call the gyri in the cerebrum. And the spaces between them are called fissures because they're pretty deep relative to what you see with the cerebrum. So folia and fissures in the cerebellum. All right, there's a structure running right down the middle called the vermis. Okay, and vermis means worm-like, so it's this worm-like structure that is connecting the two cerebellar hemispheres. All right, and in the anterior portion, so this would be posterior, this would be anterior, the cerebellum has three structures that connect it to the brainstem. So here you have the superior cerebellar peduncle, and that connects the cerebellum to the midbrain. Here you have the middle cerebellar peduncle, and that connects the cerebellum with the pons right here, and then you have the inferior cerebellar peduncle right here that's connecting the cerebellum to the medulla oblongata. And of course, all of this involves motor planning and motor coordination. So one of the ways that we, or a few of the ways that we test cerebellar function is to have our patient do walk and observe their gait. Do they have proper motion? Are their arms swinging properly with their legs? Have them point their finger to their nose and then point to your finger out in space several times relatively rapidly. That will be able to tell, if they're able to coordinate where muscles should go. And then we have them do rapid alternating movement tests where they slap their hands on their thighs, rapidly turning them over back and forth. All of those are things that can be done to test cerebellar function, and you'll do those in your physical exam lab next semester. All right, the ventricular system is a fluid flow system within your brain for cerebral spinal fluid. And so you see in blue here and blue here all of the cerebral spinal fluid and how it flows throughout the brain. So in the brain itself, in the gross brain, we can see the structures as well. So I'll point them out on the cartoon picture and then I'll relate them back to the brain below. So all of your cerebral spinal fluid is made within these structures called the choroid plexus. And so there are a couple different locations for the choroid plexus here. And that fills up your lateral ventricles. All right, so here's the corpus callosum, and your lateral ventricles would be right here. And since you have two hemispheres and you have one on each side, the lateral ventricles are ventricles 1 and 2. And then that puts fluid into the third ventricle, which is right here. All right, and you can actually see the some of the choroid plexus right here. All right, so the third ventricle would be right here. And then fluid is going to flow down here into the fourth ventricle. And then down into the spinal cord. All right, there's a hole between ventricles right here called the interventricular foramen, and that is the hole through which cerebral spinal fluid can pass back and forth. And this septum pellucidum is a thin membrane between the two cerebral hemispheres, the two lateral ventricles. So what this picture shows you is a cast of the ventricles. So what they did was they put probably latex within the ventricles of the brain, let it harden, then took away all of the brain tissue, and what you have left is an outline of what the ventricles look like. So here we see the lateral ventricle right here, and here would be the interventricular foramen, which would connect the two. As well as allow it to go into the third ventricle. The lateral ventricles actually extend all the way out here, so all of this would be considered lateral ventricle. Then you have your third ventricle. Then you have something called the cerebral aqueduct, and the cerebral aqueduct is the connection point between the third ventricle and the fourth ventricle, which is just on the anterior side of the cerebellum. And then we have lateral recesses coming off of the fourth ventricle, branches, if you will, called the foramen of Luschka. Actually, that would be the holes leading into those, and then continuing down to the spinal cord. And as far as the flow of cerebral spinal fluid goes, there is a good flow chart on page 93 of your bare bones workbook that shows how the fluid flows from the lateral ventricles all the way down to where it's supposed to go. So really, after it goes out of the ventricular system, it's going to go into the subarachnoid space that we saw around the brain and then be reabsorb back into the venous circulation through those subarachnoid granulations, returning that fluid back to circulation, which then can exit the brain and go back to the heart to be pumped out to the rest of the body. I'll also post a video of the flow of cerebral spinal fluid in Canvas for you guys to be able to see as well. All right, another view. Here we see a transverse section cut out of the brain, and you can see the choroid plexus right here on either side. You can see that interventricular foramen, which connects the left and right hemispheres to the third, or left and right ventricles to the third ventricle. And of course, the choroid plexus function is to make that cerebral spinal fluid. So it makes it and fills up the ventricles, and then it flows from there. So the limbic system is the last structure we'll talk about, and it's hard to see here, but it wraps around the thalamus as well as the basal nuclei, and comes out to the anterior portion of the brain, and connects to the amygdala anteriorly. Part of it is the hippocampus, as well as the fornix right here you see wrapping around, and here you see the mammillary body. And this entire structure right here is involved in short-term memory and memory consolidation, which is involved in converting short-term memory to long-term memory. The amygdala itself is also involved in the sense of smell, as well as fear and emotion. The actual structure of the limbic system is a little more complicated than what is presented here, but in an anatomy class I want you to get a feel for kind of where the limbic system is and some of the structures involved.